In May 1940, nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers were trapped on a single beach in France. Behind them, the English Channel. In front of them, the entire German army closing in. Hitler's tanks were less than 10 miles away. Winston Churchill privately expected to lose the war right there, on that beach. But over the next 9 days, something happened that no military planner predicted. Ordinary fishermen, weekend sailors, and ferry captains climbed into their own boats and sailed straight into a war zone to save an army that Britain's own generals believed was already lost. This is the true story of Dunkirk, not the movie, the real one. By May 1940, Hitler's forces had done the unthinkable. German tanks, moving faster than anyone believed possible, had punched straight through the Ardennes forest, a route the French had considered too dense for a major invasion. Within days, German armor split the Allied lines in two. British, French, and Belgian troops found themselves cut off from the rest of France, pushed backward toward the coast with nowhere left to run. Their only option was a small fishing town on the French coast, Dunkirk. By late May, roughly 400,000 Allied soldiers were compressed into a shrinking pocket around the town and its beaches. German panzer divisions were closing in fast. Many senior commanders on both sides assumed the battle, and possibly the war was effectively over. Some historians believe Hitler's own order to briefly halt his tanks just outside the town gave the Allies a small but critical window. The reasons for that halt order are still debated by historians today, but the pause bought precious hours the Allies desperately needed. Meanwhile, in London, the mood was grim. Churchill, who had only just become Prime Minister days earlier, was told to prepare for the worst. Military planners initially hoped they might rescue perhaps 30,000 to 45,000 men before the port fell. It seemed like an act of realism, not pessimism. Losing the bulk of Britain's trained army would have left the country dangerously exposed to a German invasion. On May 26, 1940, the Royal Navy launched a rescue mission codenamed Operation Dynamo, led by Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay from a control room carved into the cliffs of Dover. The plan relied on Royal Navy destroyers, but there simply weren't enough of them, and the beaches at Dunkirk were too shallow for large ships to get close to shore. Soldiers stood in long lines in the water, sometimes waiting for hours, chest deep, under bombardment from German aircraft, waiting for any vessel that could reach them. That's when the Admiralty made an extraordinary call. They put out a request for civilian boats, not warships, pleasure yachts, fishing trawlers, lifeboats, and small motor launches, many owned by ordinary British citizens. These vessels became known afterward as the Little Ships of Dunkirk. Owners weren't necessarily conscripted. Many volunteered on their own once they understood what was needed. Weekend sailors who had never seen combat suddenly found themselves navigating minefields and dodging Luftwaffe bombing runs to ferry soldiers from the shallow beaches out to the larger ships waiting offshore. Conditions on the beach were brutal. German aircraft strafed the shoreline repeatedly, and soldiers had little cover beyond the dunes. Discipline held remarkably well, given the circumstances. Long queues formed on the sand and in the surf as men waited their turn, even under fire. Royal Air Force fighters were flying missions overhead, but much of that air battle happened at higher altitudes, out of sight from the beach. As a result, many soldiers on the ground felt abandoned by the RAF, unaware of the fighting happening above the clouds. That resentment would linger among some veterans for years afterward, even though the RAF was suffering serious losses trying to protect the evacuation. At the harbor itself, a long stone breakwater called the East Mole, never designed to load troops, became a critical lifeline. Destroyers and larger ships tied up alongside it, and soldiers filed along its narrow length under fire to board directly. It was a fragile, improvised solution, and it worked far better than anyone expected. Meanwhile, a rear guard of French and British troops held the perimeter around Dunkirk, fighting to keep German forces from breaking through and reaching the beaches before the evacuation could finish. Their sacrifice bought critical time. Many of those rear guard units would themselves be captured or killed in the final days of the battle. Over 9 days, More than 800 vessels took part in Operation Dynamo, from Royal Navy destroyers to tiny civilian boats barely built for calm rivers, let alone a war zone. Some of these little ships made multiple trips across the channel, packed with soldiers each time. Losses were heavy. Dozens of vessels were sunk by bombs, mines, or German artillery fire along the coast. Yet the effort continued, wave after wave, because every boat that made it across could bring dozens more men home. By the end of the operation, estimates suggest around 338,000 Allied troops had been evacuated, British and French soldiers alike, a number that stunned even the operation's own planners, who had originally hoped to save a fraction of that. Dunkirk was not a victory in the traditional sense. Nearly all the heavy equipment tanks, trucks, artillery had to be abandoned on the beaches. France would fall to Germany within weeks. And yet, the rescue of so many soldiers preserved the core of Britain's trained army, at a moment when the country faced the very real threat of invasion. Churchill himself, addressing Parliament shortly afterward, was careful to remind the public that the evacuation was a deliverance, not a triumph. Wars are not won by retreats. But the survival of that army gave Britain the manpower and the morale to keep fighting through the years that followed. The Dunkirk spirit, ordinary citizens stepping up in a moment of national crisis, became a lasting symbol in British culture, referenced for decades afterward whenever the country faced hardship. Dunkirk wasn't won by generals or grand strategy. It was won by fishermen, ferry captains, and ordinary people who looked at an impossible situation and sailed toward it anyway. 338,000 men came home because of them. If you want to see more real stories from history that sound too incredible to be true, but happened anyway, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.